Oh my God, there's 90 people in here.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger.
I hear. I can't hear.
You can't hear. Well, I can hear you.
Muffled.
So take a little while for everybody to enter in. Getting everybody to join. We've got more people.
Yes, dear.
Okay, there we go. So I will continue to be letting people join as we get up and running here. I would like to welcome you all. My name is Roger Williams. I am the producer of History Author Talks, and our program here is to bring authors to readers, and we appreciate your coming to visit us tonight. I am pleased to let you know that the author's books are available for purchase at the History Author Talks website. You'll see a link that will bring you to the bookshop for History Author Talks, right underneath the author's picture. So we certainly hope that you visit historyauthortalks.com and go to the bookshop, and that's where you'll be able to find our author's books. So without further ado, I would like to our Christian Spigna. I'm going to hand it over to Christian, and he will bring it into the program. Christian, it's all
Roger.
you.
I appreciate it. I really wanted to welcome Elizabeth and Stephen. I've been excited to do this because I've been a big fan of their scholarship for a long time, and I think their books are particularly relevant today. So let me start by introducing Stephen Coss. He's the author of The Fever of 1721, The Epidemic That Revolutionized Medicine and American Politics, which was published by Simon & Schuster in 2016, and in 2017 was awarded the New England Society Book Award for Nonfiction. He received a bachelor's degree in journalism from Temple University in Philadelphia. Today he lives in Madison, Wisconsin. He got the idea to write the book about the 1721 Boston smallpox epidemic and inoculation experiment in the mid-1990s, and initially tackled it in the form of a screenplay for a feature film. Stephen spent roughly 8 years researching and writing his book. In addition to writing history, Steve has for many years worked as an advertising and marketing communications writer. He enjoys moving between the two worlds, he says, because going from business writing to writing history helps him see the history with fresh eyes and from the perspective of a general interest reader. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Christian. Also, you forgot to mention I need the money. So.
Okay, we all do, so. So tell us a little bit about the book. Tell us about The Fever of 1721.
Okay. You know, as I do that, first of all, I want to thank you, and I want to thank Roger and Mike and all the people in the Zoom audience. This is really overwhelming. I really appreciate so many people checking in. I was thinking earlier today that this phenomenon of Zoom authors, Zoom historians, is probably one of the only good things to come out of this pandemic. I don't know if this kind of thing happened before. I wasn't aware of it. So I'm grateful that it did, although with so much competition, I kind of feel like I need to do, you know, what the airlines do when they say, we know you have a choice of historians, so we appreciate your tuning into us today. So thank you. And finally, Elizabeth, I'm so pleased to meet you, albeit by Zoom. Elizabeth's book was a foundational source for my work. I'm writing about a very narrow period of time, 1721, and the years kind of surrounding it at both ends. And when I first started researching, I needed to get a much more comprehensive expert view of North America smallpox before 1721, and obviously leading up through the American Revolution. And Elizabeth's book was that for me, so I really appreciate it. Also, I don't know if she remembers, but I actually sent her a letter very early on in my research, and I don't remember now what the letter was about, and I'm sure you don't remember getting it, and I don't remember what you said, but I do remember that you replied, and I appreciated that so much as someone who was starting out on his research, in over his head and needed help. So thank you, Elizabeth. I'm honored to be here with you. Now, as far as my book goes, Fever of 1721 at a very high level is about a smallpox epidemic in 1721 Boston, and the first use of inoculation against, first I should say widespread inoculation or large-scale inoculation experiment in Western medicine. In 1721, there were about 12,000 people in Boston. That doesn't seem like a lot now, but it was the most populous town in North America. It was the third leading seaport in the British Empire. It was a thriving metropolis, such as it was. And when smallpox came in 1721, about half the town got sick, about 6,000 people. And of those 6,000 people, somewhere between 800 and 1,000 died. Many more were afflicted, and many more were left with the permanent ramifications of smallpox, which can include very severe facial scarring, disfiguring scarring, mental disabilities, physical disabilities, etc. So it was a very tragic thing, but also obviously the inoculation experiment was a great breakthrough. Now, when I first started researching this, as Christian said, originally thinking it was going to be a feature-length movie, I saw it entirely as a medical history story, as indeed it really is. But as I got more into it, I realized that in addition to being an important step along the way to the eventual eradication of smallpox, leading eventually to vaccination and vaccination to eradication, and incidentally to all the other generic versions of inoculation, or I'm sorry, vaccination, including, we hope in the near future, a vaccination against COVID. In addition to being all that, it was also a story about what happens to a society under stress. What happens when the fabric of a society, the political fabric, the social fabric gets stretched and pressured. And I think, you don't have to look too far to see that now. I mean, when I published this book in 2016, the notion of a society coming apart because of the pandemic might have seemed a little far-fetched. I don't think anybody would say that necessarily today. And what I realized as I was researching was there was a lot more to the story than this incredible scientific medical advancement. For example, at the same time the smallpox epidemic was going on, there was also sort of a pitched battle between the governor of Massachusetts, the royal governor appointed by England, and the elected House of Representatives in Boston, Massachusetts House of Representatives. The governor's name was Samuel Shute, and the leader of the House of Representatives was a man named Elisha Cook Jr. Now, I go into a lot of detail about how the politics and smallpox intersect here. Let me just, if you don't know Elisha Cook, he was sort of the proto-patriot, if you will.
Excuse me, Stephen. I want to ask everyone to mute themselves. I forgot to ask everyone to mute the system. So please, everyone, mute. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So anyway, I was talking about Elisha Cook Jr. And the thing about Cook that he's a man a lot of people don't know. I do think of him as a proto-patriot. He's the man who created what was known as the Boston Caucus. And as you probably know, if you're interested in Revolutionary era history, the Boston Caucus became a mechanism for the building rebellion against English rule, and spawned the Sons of Liberty, among other things, and became really key to the revolution. Elisha Cook was the man who started that. Elisha Cook also had an assistant named Samuel Adams Sr., whose son was Samuel Adams Jr., who of course was the firebrand of the American Revolution and who learned his politics at Cook's feet. So there was there was this tension between cook and shoot, and really it was something that existed before the smallpox epidemic. But the epidemic, as these things will, crystallized and heightened and intensified these tensions, just as I think we're seeing now. Everything gets exacerbated, everything becomes more intense. So what might have maybe taken a few years to boil over, kind of boiled over all of a sudden with pretty dramatic consequences. And in fact, sort of the actual tie between smallpox and politics in this case is that because Shute felt like he was losing control of the colony, that Cook and his people were taking control of the colony, he used smallpox as a weapon, as a political weapon. And what he did was he called them into session, and he had the power to call them into session and to release them from session. And because they wouldn't cooperate with him, he forced them to stay in session in some of the most contaminated, infected parts of Boston and later Cambridge, until they cooperated with him, until they conceded. And they didn't. And so this kind of game of chicken, if you will, went on for months and months during the outbreak, and eventually had a tragic consequence, which I won't spoil for you if you want to read about it in the book. The other thing that changed a lot too was journalism. In 1721, a printer named, a struggling 24-year-old printer named James Franklin, started a newspaper called the New England Courant. The New England Courant was started specifically as a response to inoculation. Inoculation was very controversial, and the majority of people, initially at least, were against it. James Franklin started his paper as an anti-inoculation paper, not so much because James Franklin was rabidly anti-inoculation, but James Franklin was a savvy businessman, and he realized that the way to start a paper in a town that some people said had too many papers already was to actually jump on a real hot subject, a hot controversial subject, and run with it. And that's what he did. In addition to being against inoculation, he then spun the paper into other things that were really more along the lines of what he wanted to do. So he started publishing radical Whig, republishing, I should say, radical Whig stories and documents from London. He started publishing commentaries and mockery of and humor about the government and about the clergy, which was also a very powerful influence in Boston at that time. He did things, in short, that like no other paper had ever done. And he got away with a lot of it, oddly, I think, because everyone was so distracted by smallpox. Normally, his paper would have been censored out of existence, but he managed to stay in business. He managed to do things that made him, in effect, the first independent newspaper in America, the first newspaper that wasn't trying to work to the aims and goals of the government. And he did this until he got thrown in jail. And when he was thrown in jail, he and the men who helped him publish the newspaper contributed articles that argued, I think for the first time in America, for freedom of speech and for the right to criticize the government, and that criticizing the government was actually in the best interest of the people and of the government itself. That had never been done before. That was done in 1721. And it was done because James Franklin started this paper, and B, because people were distracted by smallpox. And in fact, he didn't get arrested until the smallpox epidemic was mostly over. And at that point, people were ready to be rid of him. So smallpox, this crisis that strained the social fabric also led to some innovations and some progressive developments. And certainly the beginning of a free press, I think, is one of them. And then the last thing my book is about, in addition to smallpox and politics and journalism, is Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was working for his brother James in 1721 as an apprentice. He was also his younger brother. Benjamin was 16 years old. And he grew up in the middle of this maelstrom, this incredible, dynamic, troubling time. Benjamin Franklin in 1721, I say everything Benjamin Franklin really needed to know, he learned in 1721. cribbing off a book title that's a little more popular. But the point, I think the point is that he saw the inoculation experiment firsthand, and it affected his thinking about science and about medicine and about inventing. And it affected his thinking about his own possibilities, because the doctor who performed this experiment, Zabdiel Boylston, was like Franklin, a man who came from no privileged background, didn't have money, didn't have privilege. But eventually, when this inoculation experiment proved successful, became the most celebrated doctor in America, and was invited to London to the Royal Society, which was the preeminent scientific society in the West at that point. And he was honored. And Ben Franklin, as a 16-year-old, 17-year-old boy, saw that it was possible for a man of humble means to advance. He also kind of learned the value of diplomacy. As I said, James, his brother, was not diplomatic, to put it mildly. And Benjamin learned sort of through his brother's foibles and his brother's mistakes that sometimes the best way to get things done is not to barge through the door. So I think he learned a lot about that as well.
Excuse me, Stephen.
So that's basically the book in a nutshell. It's a book about, obviously, the central events of smallpox epidemic. It's about the political change that went along with it. It's about the beginning of American journalism, the freedom of the press. It's about what I consider the most formative period in the life of young Benjamin Franklin. And I think maybe, it's interesting what it has of relevance for today is I think that we're going to experience as a society, as a culture, kind of what I did as the writer and researcher of this book. Right now, in the case of COVID, we see it as primarily a medical challenge, which obviously it is, just as smallpox was in 1721.
Stephen,
But I think we're also going to see, when historians look back on this period in 20 years or 40 years.
Stephen, let me interject 1 second. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Because we're hearing people and people are eating and flushing toilets. So if everybody could just mute the volume on their computer, if possible, please.
okay.
This way we could focus on you.
Okay, I think we're good.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. You've been a real trooper getting through this. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No worries. I understand how it is. I've been on the other end of this too. Anyway, what I was just saying was sort of in summation. I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that I feel is relevant about my book that I didn't realize before is that I suspect, my guess is that in 20, 40, 50 years, when we can look back on this with historical perspective, we're going to see this period not just as a period of COVID, but as a period of, for better or for worse, enormous change in politics, enormous change in society, societal norms. And I think this is kind of what happens when you have a pandemic or you have an epidemic. And we can only hope that in some cases, especially in terms of generating a cure or generating today's version of vaccination, and in terms of creating a Benjamin Franklin, some 16-year-old young woman or young man right now who's living in the midst of this. I think the potential is there. Obviously, there's enormous suffering, but it's also a very dynamic time, and I expect that just as that was the case with my book in 1721, we'll see that be the case in a number of years. Thank you.
No, and thank you for pushing through with all the background noise. I also, I wanted to thank Mike Russell of the Princeton Battlefield Society. I didn't get to mention him before, but he's co-sponsoring this event. So I know Roger wanted to thank Mike. I wanted to thank him as well. At this point, Roger, we'll get into some questions for Stephen, from audience questions and other questions.
Well, I think, first of all, what I'd like to do is for Stephen and for Elizabeth, what we're going to do is we'll do questions at the end.
Okay.
After Elizabeth has done her program, but I would like to reiterate what Christian was just bringing up. I'd like to introduce Mike Russell of the Princeton Battlefield Society. This is sort of your commercial interruption, if you will. but it's not commercial at all. The Princeton Battlefield Society is our partner historic site this evening, and we are very pleased to have not only Mike Russell, but some of the other members of the Princeton Battlefield Society board with us tonight. But Mike, is there something, would you like to tell us what's going on with the Princeton Battlefield Society?
Yeah, I'll take a couple of minutes and just give a background. I hope everybody doesn't go up and go to the bathroom and the refrigerator now while I'm talking. But I'd like to thank you, Roger, and History Author Talks for having the Princeton Battlefield Society as your partner historic site for tonight's gathering. It's really a terrific gathering and a terrific topic. I hope everybody's safe and healthy and doing well during this sweltering summer we're going through right now. Just a little bit about the Princeton Battlefield Society. We are the ORFO, or the Officially Recognized Friends organization for Princeton Battlefield State Park in Princeton, New Jersey. As the licensed ORFO, we work in partnership with the state of New Jersey to maintain and preserve several aspects of the battlefield. The park and battlefield themselves encompass nearly 100 acres of what was once the farms of Quaker brothers Thomas and William Clark. It was the scene of the culminating battle of the 10 crucial days period of late December 1776 and early January 1777. These 10 days brought General Washington and his forces across the Delaware River and into contact with the Hessians and the British in Trenton and Princeton. The Battle of Princeton was an essential and vital victory for Washington's forces during the early part of the war, and it secured their foothold in New Jersey throughout the rest of the conflict. And it also renewed the Army and the cause for independence. Because of these very things, the Princeton Battlefield Society has chosen its mission to be a few parts. First, to acquire and protect and preserve and restore the lands and cultural landscape related to the Battle of Princeton, to enlarge and improve the Princeton Battlefield State Park, and just as importantly, if not most importantly, to educate the public about the Battle of Princeton, the 10 crucial days, and the American Revolution. Now, we go about doing this throughout the year by offering several events and activities to the public to engage them and get them involved in the history and research of the battle. Some of these events include Experience the Battle of Princeton, which is a large reenactment of the battle itself. The Park Cleanup Day, which is part of the larger nationwide American Battlefield Trust cleanup that takes place across the US. We also have Young Patriots Day, Archaeology Day, and of course we have scheduled tours throughout the battlefield and the Thomas Clark farmhouse. So, of course, we would love for you to support us, and we encourage you to go to our website. Here's the plug, www.pbs1777.org. And also, please follow us and look for us on social media. On our Facebook pages, we have 2 pages. We have Princeton Battlefield Society, and we also have Save Princeton. That's on Facebook. And we also have Instagram. But more importantly, and most importantly, we would love to see you at the battlefield. We would love to see you as part of our events. And please come up and talk to any of us trustees. If you're interested in volunteering, reach out to us. It'd be fantastic to have you as part of the team. Thank you, Roger.
Thanks, Mike. I put the website URL on chat to everybody.
Terrific.
So
Thank
we
you.
will now turn it back over to Christian, and Christian will introduce our next speaker.
You know, I just wanted to, before I got into Elizabeth's biography, I just wanted to say that I wanted to piggyback on what Stephen had said about her book, because when I first read her book when it was published, it really just gave me such an expansive view, and it really helped me with my own book. So I just wanted to personally thank you, Elizabeth. But To the biography. Professor Fenn teaches courses pertaining to early American, Native American, and early American West history. In September 2018, in recognition of exemplary teaching, research, and service, the Regents of the University of Colorado designated Professor Fenn a distinguished professor, one of the highest honors awarded to the university's faculty members. Professor Fenn earned her BA at Duke and her PhD at Yale. Her book, Pax Americana, The Great Smallpox Epidemic of 1775 to 82, was published in 2002 by Hill and Wang. In 2014, Fenn published Encounters at the Heart of the World, A History of the Mandan People by Hill and Wang, published, which analyzes Mandan Indian history from 1100 to 1845. And for her work, Professor Fenn received the 2015 Pulitzer Prize in History and also a 2019 Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Professor Fenn is currently at work on an expansive biography of Sacagawea, using her life story to illuminate the wider history of the Northern Plains and Rockies. Elizabeth, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the show.
Well, for your kind words, Christian, and Stephen, likewise, thanks to Roger and Mike for helping to organize this. It's really wonderful to meet every.
We lost.
And that includes the audience. Oh, have you got me?
Yeah. It's a little choppy, so
Can you hear me?
we'll push through though. Can you hear us?
Okay, yeah, I hear you. I hear you.
Okay, good.
So I want to plunge in and just talk the Pax Americana, my first book. You know, most of us know the years from 1775 to 1783 as the years of the American Revolution, but they were also years of a horrific day in British America, and I'm going to do my best to kind of limit my scope. But I do want to make clear that the epidemic was actually most consequential, not for the occupants of North America's Atlantic seaboard, but actually for the indigenous peoples of the West, who suffered the greatest mortality. Let me share my screen here just so you can, I'll share it for a little bit, and then I will revert back to myself, or somebody can remember. So this pestilence killed many and upended the lives and the futures of those who survived. And the second half of Pax Americana, I'm happy to field questions about it at the end. So for today, though, I want to turn to the Emancipation War and to that stew of people who found their lives enmeshed in the war and in smallpox. And what I want to do is address 3 episodes that actually occurred simultaneously very early in the war. These 3 episodes are the Siege of Boston, the mobilization of a regiment in Virginia, and the Siege of Quebec. All of these episodes unfolded 5 and early 1776. So let's start at Boston. In 1770, there were a few smallpox outbreaks in small towns surrounding Boston. In January of 1775, smallpox took hold in Boston itself. Many of you will recall that the battles of Lexington and Concord were fought on April 19th, 1775, and their aftermath basically marks the beginning of this siege of Boston. So, as you may recall, American militiamen, basic British, back into Boston, and then surrounded them on the hills and banks of Boston Harbor. So the British, the citizens of Boston, and the smallpox virus were all trapped in this together, and it kind of festered there through the summer of 1775. In the summer of 1775, in July, George Washington arrived at Cambridge. He takes command, and on his second day in charge, he actually orders a quarantine of any soldier who shows, as he put it, the least signs of smallpox. So smallpox was on his radar. In the summer and the fall of 1775, Patriot refugees fled Boston, and on occasion they carried smallpox with them out of Boston. And Washington was very vigilant about this. And then in December of 1775, British deserters coming out of Boston actually told George Washington that the British command was deliberately sending infected people out of the city. As he wrote it down in his journals, he said that they were sent out with a design to spread the smallpox among the troops. And with this news, Washington redoubled his efforts to keep these new arrivals away from his men. They had a military smallpox hospital. Anybody showing symptoms was sent there. And it's important to note this phenomenon that I would call differential immunity. You know, if you, especially in urban England, odds were that you'd be exposed to smallpox as a child. Smallpox at this time was endemic in England. It was constantly in background. Many of us had chickenpox or measles in this fashion. So you'd be exposed to it as a child. You might die, or you would survive, and you're blessed. You've got lifelong immunity. So what this meant was that British troops, for the most part, not vulnerable to smallpox. You know, smallpox was not yet endemic. So most Americans, whether Native American, African American, European Americans, most Americans reached adulthood unless they underwent inoculation, as Stephen was telling us about. Most Americans, reached adulthood and were vulnerable. So the American troops were more vulnerable to this disease than the British were. At any rate, Washington's efforts worked. Smallpox did not take hold among the Continentals at Boston until after the British withdrew in March of 1776 and then headed for New York. While those events I just described unfolded in New England, analogous events unfolded in Virginia. But in Virginia, there was a key difference. White Virginians kept roughly 40% of that colony's inhabitants enslaved. And that completely altered the social, political, and military dynamics of the Revolutionary War. Did so in Virginia, and did so elsewhere where people constituted large portions of the population. So in the fall of Virginia, patriots flocked to the patriot cause. The colony's royal governor, the Earl of Dunmore, made a strategic play of his own by issuing a kind of Emancipation Proclamation in November of 1775. He declared in this proclamation, he declared free all indentured servants, slaves, and belonging to rebels, so long as they were willing and able to bear for the British crown. And as you can imagine, thousands of people fled. They eventually constituted a loyalist regiment called the Ethiopian Regiment. And then in December of 1775, wearing the words "liberty to slaves" emblazoned across their chests, this Ethiopian regiment, this British loyalist patriot force outside of Norfolk, Virginia. They retreated with Lord Dunmore to ships offshore, and now smallpox infiltrated. Smallpox ripped through Dunmore's crowded vessels, particular havoc among the black troops. These were after these. Now, in May of 1776, of his Ethiopian regiment at a little island called Gwyn Island, which was in the mouth of the Piankatank River, sort of at on the Chesapeake. Basically, he wanted to just kind of air out the infection. But throughout this period, new, fresh troops, black troops, Virginia's African Americans, took advantage of basically the best opportunity they had had in years. And as they arrived, they also succumbed to smallpox, and dozens died daily on Gwyn's Island. Now, finally, on July 9th, 1776, Patriot cannon fire from the shoreline to Gwyn's Island. And Dunmore withdrew to his ships, taking those who were well enough to move along with him. Now, and when the Patriot forces landed soon thereafter, they found 130 graves, and they, at the same time, were, as one individual put it, they were struck with horror at the number of dead bodies in a state of putrefaction. They were strewn about as they put full of earth upon them. Some of those left behind were still alive. They were too sick to move. Some had actually been burned alive as a fire ripped through the camp before the Patriots landed. So bear in mind, that's going on at the same time as the siege of Boston. And now, let's move further north to Quebec. Once again, at the same time in 1775 and 1776. In November and December of 1775, American troops assembled on the plains of Abraham and besieging the city of Quebec. Now remember, Quebec at this time was in British hands. And what this was actually, it was an attempt to bring a 14th colony into the American Rebellion. You know, if this effort had been successful, we wouldn't talk about the 13 colonies today. We'd talk about the 14 colonies. So the Americans, assemble around the city of Quebec. They begin besieging the city in November and December. December 6th, 1775, reports of smallpox struck. Soon smallpox appeared among those continental forces besieging the epidemic. Now, the general in charge at Quebec, a general named Richard Montgomery, had a problem aside from that his troops' enlistments were due to expire on December 30th. He had to act. And what he did was at midnight on December 30th, 1775, he ordered a kind of a desperate assault on Quebec. The assault failed, and the Americans then settled in for a cold, smallpox-infested siege of the city. In January 1776, fresh troops began trickling in from the south. 1976, there were 2,500 troops, American troops, continental troops, surrounding Quebec, of whom 786 were sick. And the sick rolls got worse in the months or so thereafter. Almost all those men were sick to sort of rescue the city from the American siege. And when these British reinforcements arrived, the Americans, a smallpox-plagued retreat up the St. Lawrence River You can let me see the map here. So they retreated up the Richelieu River, and then down Lake. This retreat are horrific. I will read an encampment on this retreat. He wrote, "Scarcely a tent upon this isle." They were at a place called Illinois. "Tent upon this isle, but what contains one or more in distress, and continually groaning and calling in vain." So I don't want to talk too much longer, but these experiences, along with the ongoing threat of germ warfare, although it would not have been called that at the time, on the part of the British, culminated in George Washington's decision to immunize his army. And he immunized his army by using inoculation, that procedure that Stephen addresses in his book. The immunization of the American army, the inoculation of the American army, was accomplished piecemeal in 1777 in recruiting camps, but then Washington embraced it wholesale in the Valley Forge winter of 1777 and 1778, and the bulk of his troops there. So, we've heard about the bloody footprints in the snow, the shortages of food and clothing that made that winter so miserable. I'd like to suggest that the process of inoculation, which entails going through smallpox, you've got to live through smallpox to endure inoculation. Maybe Stephen can address that later. But this contributed in its own very significant way to the men. I think during the Revolutionary War, just as Stephen was suggesting was the case in Boston in 1721, and as is the case across the country today and around the world, we're seeing the ways in which epidemic disease does indeed reveal the fault lines in society, and also is a kind of a catalyst for re-engagement with science and scientific development. In this case, a public health innovation, which was large-scale, massive immunizations. So I will stop there and turn it over to questions and comments from Stephen or others.
Yeah. I just wanted to say it really is amazing when you think about it, because I think sometimes we lose sight of those campaigns, Valley Forge, but you forget how much of an issue smallpox was on the minds of the founders, the colonial population, because there was so many outbreaks that would come, I guess, as Stephen pointed out in his book, every 10 or so years, every 20 or so years in Boston. And you really forget what a role that plays in so many of the decisions in the American Revolutionary War. And I thought, your book highlights that. So thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think we're ready for questions now.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to start it off with one for Stephen. And Stephen, we wanted to ask, there are a number of smallpox epidemic diseases threatening people in 1721. What made smallpox different?
Well, I think it was a couple of things. I mean, smallpox, first of all, is a hideous disease. You didn't die. There's no way to die pretty from smallpox. Not that there's probably any way to die pretty, but people would get the telltale pox, and the pox were excruciating and they were disfiguring, and it really turned people into monsters in a sense. And so I think it was, that gave it a certain mystique or a certain, menace that maybe, a disease that was also deadly but maybe not as gruesome didn't have. The other thing is, as you mentioned, Christian, it did come with regularity. So it was the disease that killed them that they knew was coming. Boston had other epidemics besides smallpox, measles, yellow fever, influenza, diphtheria, dysentery, from bad water and things like that. There were other things that were killing people there, and they came with less regularity. But smallpox was the one that came, as you said, about every 12 years. And what made the epidemic of 1721 so deadly was in part the fact that, for a variety of reasons we can only speculate about, the smallpox did not come back. There was an epidemic in 1702 and 1703, and so then it should have come about 12 years later, and it didn't for any number of reasons. So that by 1721, there was just an enormous number of people who'd been born. Also, Boston was increasing just by the fact that it was such a thriving commercial center, commercial hub. And so, it was the disease they knew was coming and that they feared for that, And I think, I think back on the way it captured people's imaginations. I know Elizabeth mentioned Quebec, and I think it was John Adams who said after how deadly smallpox was then, that it was the king of terrors, 10 times more terrible than the British, Canadians, and Indians together. So this was a disease that really seemed even greater than it was. It was a monster in a sense. And I think that's probably why it was different. And I guess lastly, unlike, say, the plague, which is transmitted through fleas and rats and animals, smallpox humans are the vector for smallpox. So it's very much a disease of commerce and of war, as Elizabeth brilliantly pointed out in her book. Elizabeth, if you don't mind, I'm going to cite a statistic that when I first heard it blew me away, which is, far more people died of smallpox during the American Revolution than died in the American Revolution.
Right.
And, it's stunning when you think that. So it was an ancient disease that had been coming down through, centuries and centuries. It had this horrific manifestation. It was coming, people knew it, and there was nothing they could do about it. And I think that's why.
And if I can, I came across this picture, and for me, I love visual learning, and I don't know if people can see this, Roger, but this was a picture that was taken in 1901, and it's in the Jenner house, but you could see that the one boy has been inoculated and the other hasn't. And I think people forget, as you said and pointed out, Stephen, how monstrous this disease can look. And it almost makes me wonder today about the COVID. Maybe it's not taken as seriously in certain circles because there's nothing you can actually see, whereas smallpox was, you could get scars. It was a grotesque, monstrous look, as you pointed out. But the next question we wanted to ask was, what were the main reasons inoculation against smallpox was opposed by a majority of Bostonians in 1721?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think I really covered that off in my preamble, but well, the smallpox, as you can imagine, smallpox inoculation was counterintuitive. The way it worked was, in order to save someone from dying of smallpox, you gave them smallpox. And as Elizabeth said, you got sick with smallpox. If you were fortunate and if it worked the way it was supposed to work, you got what amounted to a very minor case. A few pox broke out, you were sick for a few days, and then you were immune thereafter. But it did sometimes go wrong. But it was, even before it was proven, obviously, it was so counterintuitive. Why would we want to spread smallpox by taking some from me, taking some from a pus in my arm, a pustule in my arm, and basically what they did was made an incision in the arm or leg of a person who was being inoculated, and they implanted that smallpox matter. It sounds terrible even now, and we know it worked. So, on one hand, it was just so counterintuitive that you can understand that people were turned off by it. The other thing was how they learned about it in 1721, and I didn't get a chance to talk about this, and this is one of the most interesting parts of the whole story, I think. Cotton Mather, who most of us know from the Salem witch trials, and who almost everybody universally thinks of as a bad guy, and who was in many ways a bad guy, especially during Salem. Cotton Mather was the person who came upon this idea of inoculation and who pushed it on the doctors of Boston. And Cotton Mather heard about inoculation originally from his African slave, Onesimus. Onesimus had been given to him as a gift from his congregation as a very young boy and lived with the Mather family. And at some point, we don't know exactly when, Mather asked Onesimus about a very distinctive, strange scar on his arm. And Onesimus told him the story that in Africa, in his village where he'd grown up, when smallpox came, they would take a little bit out of someone who was sick and they would plant it in someone who was well, and the person who was well would never get smallpox again. And so this was an amazing thing. Now this, Onesimus was not the only slave walking around Boston. There were other slaves who, had been inoculated. Not every African in Boston had been inoculated by any means, but there were others who had been, and no one ever thought to ask them. And why was that? Well, I think we know why that was, because it was racism, and it was the arrogance of Western medicine and a sense of Western superiority. And it's really because Onesimus told Mather about that, and then Mather subsequently confirmed it in what was the preeminent medical journal of the time, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. That was what prompted Mather to bring this to the doctors. Well, Mather brought this to the doctors, first to the two most prominent doctors in town, and asked them to share it with the others. And, they didn't take it well. They thought, first of all, Mather was a meddler, which he was. But they also thought, how can something that came from slaves, and even in the other account, it was an account from Turkey or from Greece, or both, actually, there were two, Western medicine doctors in America with English backgrounds believed were intellectually inferior. And so there was that aspect of just feeling like this can't possibly work because look who's recommending it. And of course, they were very wrong. There was also tied into that a fear of it coming from Africans and a fear of maybe Africans plotting to rise up against their masters. There had been the first really significant slave uprising in New York several years prior to this. And I think it was in the back of people's minds. And as more Africans came into New England in greater numbers, there was an increasing sense of fear of something like that happening. And some people actually posited that smallpox was a plot by Africans to kill their masters. So there were a number of reasons. I think basically it was, even under the best circumstances, it was so counterintuitive that it made sense to oppose it until proven otherwise.
Right. And we have a question from an audience member, and they want to know about cowpox, and when did the switch happen from someone being inoculated with the smallpox, the strain of the smallpox, to the switch to cowpox?
Elizabeth, do you want to take that, or you want me to?
Who do you want to? Yeah, sure, I could take that. So that transition came in 1796, 1798, when the British physician Edward Jenner had observed that milkmaids, girls, women who milked cows, tended, not sized, that the reason for that was that they had been exposed to cowpox. And so he proposed an experiment and executed an experiment that would never pass IRB approval today, in which he from a cowpox sore and implanted it in, was it William Phipps? Last name Phipps. It's an 8-year-old boy's arm. And the little boy developed a cowpox sore. And cowpox is a mild disease compared to smallpox. This little boy survived cowpox. He tried to, and he could not get the infection to take. This was a breathtaking, fabulous development. and word of it speed. There was a British historian, I believe his name Macaulay, who said it was as if an angel's trumpet had sounded. And the reason is some of you speak Spanish or Latin or so, you know, the word vaca is cow in Spanish, right? And we have vaccination today as a consequence of that. I don't know, Stephen, you may have something else to add.
No, only that the advantage, one of the advantages of vaccination over inoculation was inoculation was contagious. So if I was inoculated, I would be contagious. And also, as I said, you would get smallpox. You hoped not a bad case, but you could get a very bad case. And with vaccination,
Yes.
it was safer and it was less contagious, less chance of contagion. So it was a major upgrade, if you will, on inoculation.
Elizabeth, we have another audience question. And this question is, how was inoculation against smallpox handled by the British, Hessian, and French armies?
The British, Hessian, and French armies did not need to do nearly so much inoculation because most of their troops had garnered immunity already. We do know that the British inoculated people. They would periodically poll the troops and send them off for inoculation. They did this at Boston, for example. I cannot answer the question of how Hessians and French troops handled it, or even whether they handled it. I just, you know, I don't want to steer you wrong by giving, you know, incorrect information on that.
Right. Well, I have another audience question for you, Elizabeth, and it's, what percentage of people died from smallpox during the American Revolution? Now, I guess we could discern between soldiers. I guess we're asking soldiers. What percentage of soldiers died?
Yeah.
Do we have any idea about that?
We could probably do some math and come up with a baseline number of soldiers, and you know, from which to start. When I wrote the book, I was really interested in the numbers of people who died across the continent in North America. So the population of the continent at this time is probably about 2 million. Half of whom are Native American. And what I calculated as a baseline during these years is that at a bare minimum, those that I could count in the 1,000 people died.
Can you repeat that? Because we lost you for a second.
Roughly the number of, oh, sorry. So at a bare minimum, 30,000 people.
30,000 people. Okay.
130,000.
Okay. Out of the 2 million.
130,000. So we're talking about, So we're talking about the number of people who have died of coronavirus in the U.S. today.
Right. Okay. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Well, I think we're out of time, Roger.
So,
and odds are it was okay.
So I think, so I want to thank, I would like to thank Elizabeth, Stephen, and I would like to thank Christian and Mike Russell and our friends at the Princeton Battlefield Society for being our partner historic site. I posted on the chat the bookshop for people who would like to purchase the books from our authors. Remember to go to historyauthortalks.com and register for next week's episode, where Christian will switch hats and be one of our guests to talk about his book, The Founding Martyr, which is a terrific biography of Joseph Warren, everyone needs to know about Dr. Warren. We also have Stephen Freed, who's written a terrific biography of Benjamin Rush. So we're sort of keeping with a medical theme here. And we have some other wonderful programs coming up. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening. If you have other questions that were not answered, you can also go to the contact page of historyauthortalks.com and give me your question, and I will forward them to the authors and get your questions answered. Thank you again to everybody, and stay healthy, obviously, and have a great evening. Thank you all.
Right.
Thank you.